Bumpy Johnson left Frank Lucas $50 million in cash. But he didn't tell him where. The FBI searched Harlem for 10 years, tore apart buildings, followed every lead. They even raided the exact location in 1969, stood 10 feet away from the money, and walked right past it. This is the story of the most genius hiding spot in criminal history. July 8, 1968. One day after Bumpy Johnson's funeral. Frank Lucas sat alone in Bumpy's apartment on 409 Edgecombe Avenue in Harlem, surrounded by silence that felt heavier than grief. The place was empty now, quiet in a way that made your skin crawl. All of Bumpy's people had paid their respects and scattered into the night. The Italian mafia had circled like vultures, sniffing for weakness, then moved on when they found nothing to feast on. Nicky Barnes and his crew had made their threats, flexed their muscles, and disappeared back into the streets. But Frank stayed. Because Frank knew something nobody else knew. Bumpy Johnson didn't die broke. Everyone assumed Bumpy had nothing. The man lived modestly, drove a regular car, wore nice suits but nothing flashy, nothing that screamed power or wealth. When he died, his bank account showed maybe $50,000. Chump change. Pocket money for a man who'd controlled Harlem's underworld for 40 years. But Frank knew better. 3 months before Bumpy died, they'd had a conversation late at night, just the two of them. Bumpy was drinking whiskey, staring out the window at Harlem like he was memorizing every street corner, every rooftop, every shadow. And he said something Frank would never forget. "Frank, you know what separates a smart gangster from a dead gangster?" Frank leaned forward. "What's that, boss?" Bumpy turned, his eyes sharp even through the whiskey haze. "A smart gangster never lets anyone know how much money he really has. Not the government. Not his crew. Not even his family. Because the moment people know you're rich, they start plotting how to take it from you." Frank nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. "So you keep it hidden?" Bumpy smiled, that knowing, dangerous smile that made him a legend. "I've been keeping it hidden for 30 years, Frank. 30 years of skimming. 30 years of taking my cut and putting it somewhere nobody can find it. Not the cops. Not the IRS. Not the mafia. Nobody." Frank's heart started pounding. He leaned forward even more. "How much we talking about, boss?" Bumpy took a long, slow sip of whiskey, savoring the moment. $50 million. In cash. Frank's eyes went wide. His mouth went dry. 50 million? Where the hell is $50 million in cash? Bumpy looked at Frank, really looked at him, like he was deciding something important, something permanent. "Frank, I'm getting old. My heart ain't what it used to be. And if something happens to me, I need to know that money goes to someone who'll use it right. Someone who will keep Harlem strong. Someone who won't waste it or let the white mobsters take it." Frank could barely breathe. "You want me to have it?" "I want you to earn it." Bumpy's voice dropped, became deadly serious. "When I die, and I'm going to die soon, I can feel it, you're going to have to figure out where I hid it. I'm not going to tell you. Because if you can't find it, you don't deserve it. But if you can find it, it's yours. All 50 million. And you use it to build an empire that makes mine look like a lemonade stand." Frank stared at Bumpy, searching his face for any sign of a joke, any hint of a test. "You serious?" "Dead serious." Bumpy's eyes burned with intensity. "Prove you're as smart as I think you are, Frank. Prove you're worthy of being the next king of Harlem." That conversation haunted Frank for 3 months. And now Bumpy was dead. And Frank was sitting in Bumpy's apartment, trying to figure out where the hell a 62-year-old gangster would hide $50 million in cash. Frank started searching. He tore apart the apartment like a man possessed, checked behind every painting, pulled up floorboards, opened every drawer, looked in the ceiling, the walls, the closets, the bathroom. Nothing. No hidden safe. No loose floorboards with cash underneath. No secret compartment in the furniture. Frank spent 6 hours searching that apartment and found absolutely nothing. He sat down on Bumpy's couch, frustrated, exhausted, his mind racing. Where the hell would Bumpy hide $50 million? And then Frank realized something so obvious it made him angry at himself for not seeing it sooner. Bumpy wouldn't hide it in his apartment. Too obvious. Too risky. If the cops ever raided him, they'd tear the place apart and find it in 5 minutes. Bumpy was smarter than that. Way smarter. Frank started thinking like Bumpy. Where would a man who didn't trust anyone, not the government, not the mafia, not even his own family, where would that man hide $50 million in cash? If you're already hooked by this story, hit that subscribe button right now, because what Frank discovers is going to blow your mind. I promise you've never heard this version before. Frank thought about Bumpy's life, his habits, his patterns. Bumpy owned property all over Harlem: buildings, apartments, warehouses. Maybe the money was in one of those. Frank started visiting every property Bumpy owned. 17 buildings in total. He searched basements, attics, storage rooms, behind walls, under floors. He spent 2 weeks going through every single property, and found nothing. Zero. Not a single dollar. Frank was starting to panic. What if Bumpy was lying? What if there was no $50 million? What if this was some kind of test and Frank was failing it? But no, Bumpy wasn't a liar. If Bumpy said there was $50 million, there was $50 million. Frank just had to think harder. Then Frank remembered something else Bumpy used to say. Frank, the best place to hide something valuable is in plain sight. People always look for hidden things in hidden places. But if you hide something in a place everyone can see, nobody looks twice. In plain sight. Frank's mind started racing. What did Bumpy own that was in plain sight? What place did everyone in Harlem know about, but nobody would think to search? And then it hit him like lightning splitting through fog. The funeral home. Bumpy Johnson owned a funeral home on 125th Street. Renaissance Funeral Home. Bumpy bought it in 1955, said he wanted to make sure black folks in Harlem could get a proper burial without being overcharged by white funeral directors. Everyone knew Bumpy owned it. Everyone respected it. But nobody ever thought twice about it. It was just a funeral home, a business, a community service, a place of dignity and respect. Frank drove to Renaissance Funeral Home at midnight. He let himself in with Bumpy's keys, his hands shaking slightly as he turned the lock. The place was dark, empty, quiet, just rows of caskets in the showroom and embalming equipment in the back. Frank walked through the showroom, past the caskets, past the flowers that still smelled faintly sweet, into the back room where they prepared the bodies. And that's when Frank saw it. A walk-in freezer, the kind funeral homes used to store bodies before embalming. Frank's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He opened the freezer door. Cold air hit his face like a slap, fog rolling out into the warm room. Inside were 3 bodies on gurneys, covered with white sheets, waiting to be prepared for burial. Frank walked up to the first body, his breath visible in the freezing air. He lifted the sheet with trembling hands. It was a real body, an old woman, probably 80 years old, died of natural causes. Frank covered her back up respectfully, moved to the second body. Real body, middle-aged man, heart attack. Frank covered him up. Then Frank pulled the sheet all the way off, his hands moving faster now, adrenaline surging through his veins. The entire gurney was covered in cash. Millions of dollars just sitting there, hidden under a sheet in a funeral home freezer, disguised as a dead body. Frank started laughing, he couldn't help it. A wild, disbelieving laugh that echoed off the freezer walls. Bumpy Johnson, you brilliant son of a bitch. Smash that like button if you're realizing right now how genius this hiding spot was, because this is the wildest place anyone has ever hidden money in history. Frank spent the next hour searching the freezer like a man possessed. There were 5 more bodies in a secondary freezer in the basement. 6 gurneys total, all of them covered in white sheets, all of them filled with cash instead of corpses. Frank did the math, his mind spinning with the enormity of it. Each gurney held approximately $8 million in $100 bills. 6 gurneys. That's $48 million, close enough to Bumpy's $50 million estimate. The remaining $2 million was probably in smaller bills or had been spent over the years maintaining the illusion. But Frank had found it. Bumpy's entire fortune, hidden in plain sight in a funeral home, disguised as dead bodies. The most perfect hiding spot in the history of organized crime. Frank sat down on the floor of that freezer, surrounded by $48 million in cash, and he started crying. Not because of the money, though God knows that was overwhelming, but because of what the money represented. Bumpy had trusted him. Had believed in him. Had left him everything. And now it was Frank's responsibility to honor that trust, to build the empire Bumpy wanted him to build, to prove he was worthy of being the next king of Harlem. Frank Lucas walked out of that funeral home at 3 in the morning with a plan crystallizing in his mind. He wasn't going to move the money. Not yet. Because Bumpy was right, the best hiding spot is the one nobody knows about. And as long as that money stayed in the funeral home, frozen on gurneys, disguised as bodies, nobody would ever find it. Not the cops. Not the FBI. Not the Italian Mafia. Not Nicky Barnes. Nobody. Frank could access it whenever he needed it, take what he needed for his operation, and leave the rest hidden. Perfectly safe. Perfectly invisible. But Frank wasn't the only person looking for Bumpy's money. August 1968. 1 month after Bumpy's death. FBI agent Dennis McCarthy got a tip from an informant, the kind of tip that makes a career or destroys it. Bumpy Johnson had a fortune. $50 million hidden somewhere in Harlem. If you find it, you can seize it. Use it to fund your investigations. Find it. McCarthy was a 20-year veteran of the FBI, specialized in organized crime, with a reputation for being relentless. He'd been tracking Bumpy Johnson for 15 years, tried to arrest him a dozen times, but Bumpy was too smart, too connected, too careful. McCarthy never got him. And now Bumpy was dead. But if Bumpy really had $50 million hidden somewhere, McCarthy wanted to find it. Not for personal gain, for the Bureau. $50 million could fund FBI operations in New York for a decade, could take down the Mafia, could clean up Harlem once and for all. McCarthy assembled a team, 6 agents, all experienced, all determined, and they started searching. They got warrants for every property Bumpy owned, searched his apartment, his buildings, his warehouses with fine-tooth combs. They interviewed Bumpy's family, his associates, his enemies. They followed leads, chased rumors, investigated banks. Nothing. No $50 million. No hidden accounts. No safe deposit boxes. McCarthy started to think the tip was bullshit. But then he got another lead, a second informant, someone close to Bumpy, someone who claimed Bumpy used to joke about where he hid his money. He said he kept it cold. Said it was the safest place in the world. Said even if the cops found it, they'd never recognize it. McCarthy thought about that for days. Kept it cold. What the hell does that mean? A freezer? A refrigerated warehouse? A cold storage facility? McCarthy's team started investigating every cold storage facility in Harlem, commercial freezers, meat lockers, ice cream factories. They searched for 3 months, interviewed workers, checked manifests, looked for any connection to Bumpy Johnson. Nothing. Zero. No evidence Bumpy ever used any cold storage facility in New York. McCarthy was running out of options. His supervisors were getting impatient, asking pointed questions about budget and resources. The FBI had spent thousands of dollars chasing a rumor, and they had nothing to show for it. But McCarthy couldn't let it go, because he knew Bumpy knew how smart Bumpy was, knew Bumpy wouldn't just make $50 million disappear into thin air. It had to be somewhere. So McCarthy changed his strategy. Instead of searching for the money directly, he started watching the people who might know where it was. He put surveillance on Frank Lucas, on Nicky Barnes, on everyone in Bumpy's inner circle. Watched their movements, their spending, their behavior with the patience of a hunter. And that's when McCarthy noticed something strange. Frank Lucas was spending money. Not crazy money, not Cadillacs and diamonds and penthouses, but more than a driver should have. New clothes. Nice meals. Small investments. Nothing flashy, nothing obvious, but enough to make McCarthy suspicious. Where was Frank getting his money? Frank didn't have a job. Didn't have a business. Hadn't inherited anything from Bumpy officially. So where was the cash coming from? McCarthy got a warrant to tap Frank's phone. Followed him for 6 months, building a pattern, piecing together a puzzle. And McCarthy noticed something, a routine so consistent it couldn't be coincidence. Once a month, late at night, Frank Lucas would drive to 125th Street, park near Renaissance Funeral Home, go inside for 30 minutes, then leave. Every single month. Same routine. Same time. Like clockwork. McCarthy thought that was odd. Why would Frank Lucas be visiting a funeral home at midnight once a month? What business could he possibly have there? McCarthy started investigating Renaissance Funeral Home, pulled the business records with methodical precision. Bumpy Johnson had owned it since 1955. But after Bumpy died, the ownership transferred to a shell company, no name attached, just a corporation buried under layers of paperwork. That was suspicious. Very suspicious. McCarthy got a warrant to search Renaissance Funeral Home. September 1969, 15 months after Bumpy's death. McCarthy and his team raided the funeral home at 6 in the morning, coming in hard with dogs, metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar, the full arsenal. They searched the entire building, the showroom, the office, the embalming room, the basement. They checked the walls, the floors, the ceilings with painstaking thoroughness. They opened every casket in the showroom, searched every storage closet, looked in every possible hiding place. And they found nothing. McCarthy was furious. He knew something was there, he could feel it in his bones, that cop instinct that never lies. But they couldn't find it. McCarthy's team searched the funeral home for 8 hours, tore the place apart systematically, and came up empty-handed. As McCarthy was leaving, defeated and angry, the funeral director, an old black man named Samuel, stopped him at the door. "Agent McCarthy, you mind telling me what you were looking for?" McCarthy looked at Samuel, exhausted and frustrated. "We have reason to believe Bumpy Johnson hid a significant amount of money in this building." Samuel laughed, a genuine, surprised laugh. "Bumpy hiding money here? Agent, this is a funeral home. We prepare bodies. We bury the dead. We don't store cash. You knew Bumpy owned this place?" "Of course I knew. Bumpy was a good man. Gave black folks in Harlem dignity in death. But he never hid anything here. This is a legitimate business." McCarthy didn't believe him. But without evidence, there was nothing he could do. McCarthy left the funeral home empty-handed, but he didn't give up. For the next 10 years, McCarthy kept searching. He raided properties, followed leads, interviewed informants with obsessive determination. He became consumed by it. His colleagues started calling him Captain Ahab behind his back, the man chasing a white whale that didn't exist. 1975, 7 years after Bumpy's death. Frank Lucas had built an empire that would have made Bumpy proud, maybe even a little jealous. Using Bumpy's $48 million as seed capital, Frank created the most sophisticated heroin operation in American history. He was making $1 million a day, owned properties across New York and New Jersey, had corrupted dozens of cops, had partnerships with the Italian mafia that seemed impossible just years before. Frank Lucas had become everything Bumpy wanted him to be, the king of Harlem, the richest black gangster in America, a legend in his own time. But Frank made one critical mistake. One moment of vanity that would cost him everything. He wore a chinchilla coat to the Muhammad Ali vs. Joe Frazier fight in 1971. And that coat, luxurious, expensive, impossible to ignore, got him noticed. Detective Richie Roberts started investigating Frank, building a case brick by brick, following the money trail that Frank thought he'd hidden so well. And in 1975, Richie Roberts and the DEA raided Frank's house in Teaneck, New Jersey, coming through the door like an avalanche. They arrested Frank Lucas. Seized $584,000 in cash. Found heroin. Found ledgers. Found evidence of the entire operation laid out like a roadmap to hell. Frank Lucas was facing life in prison, multiple life sentences, actually, enough time to die in a cell 10 times over. And sitting in that jail cell, staring at concrete walls and a future that looked like nothing but darkness, Frank made a decision. He was going to cooperate. He was going to tell the feds everything about the mafia, about the corrupt cops, about the heroin operation, about everything. Including Bumpy's $50 million. Frank called for a meeting with the prosecutors. Richie Roberts. Dennis McCarthy. The DEA. The FBI. Everyone who'd been hunting him for years. Frank sat down at a table with 10 federal agents staring at him like wolves circling wounded prey. And Frank smiled, that same knowing smile Bumpy used to have. I'll give you everything. The whole operation. The mafia connections. The corrupt NYPD detectives. The supply chain from Vietnam. All of it. But first, I want to tell you about Bumpy Johnson's money. McCarthy leaned forward, his heart pounding. After 10 years of searching, after becoming a joke to his colleagues, after chasing ghosts and shadows and dead ends, he was finally going to get the truth. Frank's smile widened. You've been looking for $50 million for 10 years. And you searched Renaissance Funeral Home in 1969. You were standing 10 feet away from it and didn't even know. McCarthy's face went red. His hands clenched into fists. What are you talking about? Frank explained the whole thing. The gurneys. The freezers. The bodies that weren't bodies. The cash frozen and preserved, hidden in plain sight for 7 years while the FBI tore Harlem apart looking for it. Hidden so perfectly that agents had walked right past it, had stood in the same room with $48 million and never suspected a thing. McCarthy couldn't believe it. His voice came out strangled. You're telling me Bumpy Johnson hid $50 million by disguising it as corpses in a funeral home freezer? $48 million. Close enough. And yes, that's exactly what I'm telling you. McCarthy wanted to punch a wall. Wanted to scream. His team had searched that funeral home for 8 hours, opened every closet, checked every room with professional thoroughness. But they never thought to check under the sheets on the gurneys in the freezer. Why would they? Those were bodies. Dead people waiting to be prepared for burial. Nobody checks dead bodies for hidden cash. It was the perfect hiding spot, so obvious it became invisible. McCarthy immediately got a warrant. Sent a team to Renaissance Funeral Home with explicit instructions. They went straight to the freezers, pulled back the sheets on the gurneys with trembling hands, and found exactly what Frank said they'd find. $48 million in cash, frozen solid, wrapped in plastic, preserved perfectly, still hidden after 7 years. The FBI seized all of it, every dollar, every bill. It was the largest cash seizure in FBI history at that time. McCarthy finally got his white whale. But he didn't feel victorious. He felt stupid. Because Bumpy Johnson had outsmarted him, had hidden $48 million in the most obvious place imaginable, and McCarthy had walked right past it with a team of trained federal agents. The funeral home director, Samuel, was arrested for aiding and abetting. But Samuel claimed he had no idea the money was there, swore it on everything he held sacred. Said Bumpy had told him those gurneys were special remains that needed to stay frozen indefinitely. Samuel thought they were bodies, real bodies, people who died under circumstances that required them to be preserved for legal reasons. Samuel had been guarding $48 million for 7 years and didn't even know it. The prosecutors didn't believe him. But they couldn't prove he knew. Samuel served 2 years for obstruction and was released, taking whatever secrets he had to his own grave. Hit that subscribe button if you're realizing that Bumpy Johnson was the smartest criminal in American history, because this hiding spot is legendary. But the story doesn't end there. Because Frank Lucas used that $48 million to build his empire. And what he did with it changed organized crime forever. When Frank found Bumpy's money in 1968, he didn't take it all at once. He was smart, learned from watching Bumpy operate for years. He took $2 million to start. Used it to fund his first heroin shipment from Vietnam, establishing connections that would make him untouchable. That $2 million investment turned into $10 million in profit in 6 months. Frank took another $5 million from the funeral home, expanded his operation exponentially, bought more heroin, hired more dealers, corrupted more cops. That $5 million turned into $30 million. By 1970, Frank had turned Bumpy's $48 million into over $100 million in total wealth. He owned buildings. Had legitimate businesses. Had investments in real estate, restaurants, nightclubs. Frank Lucas had become richer than Bumpy ever was, and he did it all quietly, under the radar, exactly the way Bumpy taught him. The Italian mafia respected Frank. The black gangsters feared him. The cops couldn't touch him. For 5 years, Frank Lucas was untouchable, invisible and invincible at the same time. But then came the chinchilla coat. The one decision that destroyed everything. Frank's vanity. His need to be seen. His desire to show the world he was somebody. That coat got him arrested, got his empire dismantled, got him sentenced to 70 years in prison. And when Frank sat in that prison cell, alone with his thoughts and his regrets, he thought about Bumpy's advice, the words that echoed in his mind like a prophecy he should have heeded. The moment you want people to know you're rich, you're finished. Stay invisible. Stay quiet. The silent man lives. The loud man dies. Frank had stayed silent for 5 years, built an empire worth $100 million. Then he wore a chinchilla coat to a boxing match, and lost everything. But here's what nobody talks about, the secret that most people never learned. That $48 million Bumpy left Frank? Frank had already spent most of it by the time he got arrested. He'd invested it, laundered it, turned it into legitimate assets, real estate, businesses, offshore accounts. The FBI seized $584,000 from Frank's house, but they never found the rest. Because Frank had learned from Bumpy. He'd hidden his money in places the government couldn't touch, shell corporations in the Cayman Islands, real estate under fake names, investments in legitimate businesses that had no obvious connection to Frank Lucas. By the time Frank got arrested, he'd successfully laundered over $50 million. The government got $584,000. Frank kept the rest. And when Frank got out of prison in 1981 after serving 7 years, he still had access to millions. He didn't flaunt it. Didn't spend it. Just lived quietly, modestly, stayed under the radar like Bumpy taught him. Frank Lucas died in 2019 at age 88, natural causes, in his sleep, peaceful and undisturbed. And people asked, how much money did Frank really have when he died? The answer? Nobody knows. Frank's estate was valued at less than $500,000 officially. But people close to Frank said he had accounts and assets all over the world, money hidden in the same way Bumpy taught him. Quietly. Invisibly. In places nobody would think to look. Frank Lucas learned from the best, and he applied those lessons perfectly, for a while, until vanity got the better of him. But even after his arrest, even after his cooperation, even after serving time, Frank Lucas still came out ahead. Because he understood what Bumpy understood. Real wealth isn't about what people see. It's about what people don't see. Bumpy Johnson hid $48 million by disguising it as dead bodies in a funeral home freezer. Frank Lucas turned that $48 million into an empire. And even when the empire fell, Frank kept enough hidden to live comfortably for the rest of his life. Leave a comment telling me, Was Bumpy Johnson's hiding spot the smartest move in criminal history, or was Frank Lucas smarter for turning that money into a fortune? Because that's the question everyone's still debating. The FBI searched Harlem for 10 years looking for Bumpy's money. They raided buildings, followed leads, investigated dozens of people. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, thousands of man-hours, and they walked right past $48 million hidden in plain sight. Dennis McCarthy, the FBI agent who led the search, retired in 1985. And in his retirement interview, a reporter asked him, "What was the biggest case you ever worked on?" McCarthy said, "Bumpy Johnson's missing $50 million. We searched for 10 years, and when we finally found it, I realized we'd searched the exact location in 1969 and missed it. That's when I learned the most important lesson of my career. The best criminals don't hide things in secret places. They hide things in obvious places, because people always overlook the obvious." McCarthy was right. Bumpy Johnson taught Frank Lucas that lesson. And Frank Lucas applied it to everything: his heroin operation, his money laundering, his investments. Frank hid his empire in plain sight. Legitimate businesses. Real estate. Legal investments. And even when the government caught him, they only found a fraction of what he really had. Because Frank learned from Bumpy. The silent man lives. The loud man dies. Bumpy died quietly in his sleep. Frank lived to 88. Both men understood the game better than anyone else. Hit that like button one more time if this story taught you something about power, money, and the art of staying invisible. Because that's what Bumpy and Frank's legacy is really about. Not the crime. Not the drugs. Not the violence. The intelligence. The strategy. The ability to see what everyone else misses. Bumpy Johnson hid $48 million by turning it into something nobody would ever suspect: dead bodies. Frank Lucas turned that $48 million into an empire by doing business smarter than the mafia. And when it all came crashing down, Frank still walked away with more money than most people will ever see in their lives. Subscribe right now if you want more untold stories about the people who changed history by thinking differently. Because Bumpy Johnson and Frank Lucas didn't just break the rules, they rewrote them. And 50 years later, people are still talking about the funeral home. The frozen cash. The 10-year FBI manhunt. The empire built on a dead man's hidden fortune. Rest in peace, Bumpy Johnson. 1905 to 1968. The man who hid $48 million in the most genius way imaginable. Rest in peace, Frank Lucas. 1930 to 2019. The man who found it, used it, and built a legend. The hiding spot that stumped the FBI for 10 years. The money that built an empire. The lesson that still matters today. Stay invisible. Stay quiet. And never, ever wear a chinchilla coat to a boxing match. If this story blew your mind, smash that like button right now and subscribe for more untold crime stories that will keep you hooked. Drop a comment and tell me, was Bumpy Johnson a genius, or was Frank Lucas the real mastermind? Let's debate in the comments below. And remember, the best secrets are hidden in plain sight. I'll see you in the next one.